Tonight, the Forbidden Dispensary is stepping into the rough, unsettling, and distinctly unromantic side of what most people like to call a miracle. What now sounds like a neat little legend about a lucky accident once reeked of wet mold, old tea gone stale, and raw, exhausted desperation. In that world, a scratch from a rose thorn or a kid's scraped knee wasn't just annoying. It was a coin flip with death. So before you settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely vibe with what the Forbidden Dispensary does here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's always wild to see this weird little community lighting up from all over the planet. Silence your notifications, fill your lungs, and let's dive in. To grasp the scale of the revolution, you first have to sit with the silence that came before it. Not a peaceful, meditative calm, but a suffocating, haunted stillness that clung to hospital wards across the globe before the 1930s. It was the silence of people holding their breath, the silence of a physician standing over a patient, having used up every tool, every trick, every inch of training, and having nothing left except the brutal work of watching. It was the soundless weight of powerlessness in the face of an enemy no one could see and no one really understood. Before penicillin, humanity was losing a war it didn't even realize it was fighting. The enemy was bacteria, and the battlefield was the human body. Picture a world washed in grey, where the tiniest pleasures of ordinary life were always overshadowed by a constant, low, buzzing fear. A kid takes a tumble in the yard and skins a knee. A line cook slices the side of a finger while working through a crate of vegetables. A man catches a splinter in his palm out in the shed. Today, that's soap, water, an antiseptic wipe, maybe a bandage, and you move on. In that world, every one of those little openings was a door left unlocked, an invitation, a vacancy sign glowing for whatever filth happened to be passing by. The air, the dirt, the doorknobs in your own house were crawling with microscopic predators. Staphylococcus, streptococcus, ancient creatures that had been tearing into living cells long before history started keeping score. A tiny cut could swell in just a few days, turning hot, red and tight, throbbing with each heartbeat. Then the red streaks would start to climb the arm or the leg like a fuse burning under the skin. Fever follows, then chills, then wild, half-conscious rambling. That's sepsis, blood poisoning. It's the body's last failing attempt to fight an infection that's no longer local, but everywhere at once. The doctors of the late 1800s and early 1900s were anything but fools. In plenty of ways, they were brilliant. They had anatomy wired. They could set a shattered limb with almost artistic precision. Diagnostics were getting sharper by the decade. Once anesthesia became part of the toolkit, surgeons could push deeper and do more daring work inside the body. They could take out a ruptured appendix, carve away diseased sections of intestine, cut out a tumor hidden in a maze of organs. They were masters of what you could see and touch, structure, mechanics, the physical map of flesh. But when the invisible invader of infection slipped in after the last stitch was tied and the scalpel was put away, those same masters shrank down to the role of field nurses. They could change bandages. They could offer opiates and kind words. They could write notes as the pulse got weaker. And that was it. They did have weapons, if you want to call them that, but they were blunt, savage, and careless in their aim. In the 1860s, Joseph Lister started a revolution with antiseptics, dousing everything in carbolic acid wounds, instruments, his own hands, even the air in the operating room. It was chemical-scorched earth. Carbolic acid could kill bacteria, yes, but it also burned the raw tissues of the patient and ate at the skin of the surgeon. It was a poison deployed in the grim hope that maybe, if you were careful, it would poison the invader just a little more than it poisoned the host. It was a treatment that doubled as confession. The only way they knew to fight the microscopic enemy was to terrorize the battlefield itself. And even then, it only reached the surface. Once an infection found its way deep into the lungs, the blood, or the inner lining of the heart, medicine threw up its hands. There was nothing left to do. Think about the hospitals of that time. From the outside, many of them were masterpieces of Victorian design, high arches, long windows, heavy stone, full of civic pride. Inside, they were warehouses of dread. These weren't places you expected to walk out of whistling. These were where you went when the people who loved you couldn't manage your illness at home anymore. Places to die with the sheets tucked in and the chart filled out. The wards were crowded with casualties of a war no one had named. Young men gasping their way through pneumonia, lungs slowly filling until they drowned in their own fluids. Women who had survived childbirth only to be brought down days later by childbed fever, a streptococcal infection shuttled casually from one mother to the next by the same pair of unwashed hands. Decades earlier, in Vienna, a physician named Ignaz Semmelweis had practically screamed himself hoarse, trying to get his colleagues to see the nightmare they were causing. "Wash your hands," he begged. "You are carrying death from bed to bed." For his trouble, he earned professional exile and a reputation for lunacy. The medical establishment refused to accept a truth that would make them the villains in their own story. Children were the easiest prey. A simple sore throat could snowball into scarlet fever, leaving survivors with damaged hearts. Or it could become rheumatic fever, an inflamed hell of swollen joints that could scar the valves of the heart permanently, condemning a child to a short, fragile life. Diphtheria could form a rubbery, suffocating sheet of tissue at the back of the throat, cutting off air as a mother watched helplessly at the bedside. These weren't rare curses. They were everyday terrors woven into family life. Every parent carried the knowledge that a cough, a fever, a small infection could go from nuisance to funeral in a matter of days. In 1900, pneumonia was the leading cause of death in the United States. It was so common, so quick, and so certain that people had a bitter nickname for it: the old man's friend. And privilege didn't buy protection. In 1881, President James A. Garfield was shot. The bullet lodged near his pancreas. Bad, yes. Instantly fatal, probably not. What killed him was not the slug, but his own doctors, who repeatedly dug into the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized tools, hunting for the bullet like it was a lost coin in a couch cushion. For 80 days, the President of the United States faded from sepsis. The assassin's bullet only opened the door. His physicians escorted the infection in. That was medicine's reality. The brightest doctors in the world, caring for one of the most powerful men on earth, could do nothing but document his decline. They were like astronomers charting the dimming of a far-off star. They could take measurements. They could calculate when the light would finally go out. But they couldn't do a thing to change its fate. This vast, unspoken helplessness sat at the core of medicine. For all the advances, all the polished instruments and mounting knowledge, it was nearly naked in the face of the microscopic realm. The stage wasn't set for a hero. It was set for a miracle, an accidental, almost shy miracle that would start, as they often do, not with a roar, but with a barely audible whisper. Humanity, of course, hadn't been doing nothing in the thousands of years leading up to that whisper. Long before sleek labs in London or Paris, long before anyone had words like bacterium or pathogen, people groped in the dark for ways to tame infected wounds. They weren't scientists. They were desperate experimenters. Their tools were tradition, observation, and the occasional stroke of outrageously dumb luck. Every once in a while, that blind fumbling would brush up against a deep, hidden truth. They couldn't see it, couldn't name it, but they felt the faintest hint of the cure, like hearing a voice through a wall. Let's go way back to the baked banks of the Nile around 1600 BCE. Somewhere in Thebes, a physician bends over a patient with a foul, festering wound. He consults his scrolls, maybe an ancestor of what we now call the Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents still in existence. He has no concept of bacteria or infection. To him, this wound lives under the influence of spirits, curses, or a disturbance in the body's mysterious humors. But his training, handed down from teacher to student for generations, tells him what to do. He takes a piece of bread, He lets it sit until it grows a bloom of mold. Then he pounds that moldy bread into a paste and presses it into the wound. Without knowing it, he's smearing on a crude, impure smear of penicillin-like substances. He has no idea why it sometimes seems to work. He just knows that in certain cases, the angry red edge of the wound softens, the swelling fades, and the skin knits itself back together. That sort of thing shows up again and again across history. In different times and different cultures, people turned to similar folk remedies. Molds on bread, cobwebs on cuts, special soils packed onto open flesh. The ancient Greeks, Serbs, Chinese, and countless others all had some version. They were watching a microscopic war in total ignorance, seeing only the aftermath, a wound that healed instead of rotting. They were like ancient sky watchers, watching a solar eclipse, talking about devouring dragons or feuding gods, yet describing the event with perfect practical detail. They saw antibiosis one organism suppressing or killing another. But the why of it all was still pure sorcery. For that whisper to turn into a voice, for magic to harden into science, humanity needed a new set of tools and a new way of thinking. It needed magnification. It needed people who could stare the invisible enemy in the face. The 19th century delivered that framework. And in Paris in the 1870s, Louis Pasteur, one of the giants of that era, was about to give this strange phenomenon a name. Pasteur was a foundational figure in microbiology. While studying anthrax, a lethal bacterial disease, he noticed something peculiar. Sometimes his careful pure cultures of anthrax bacilli would get dirty, contaminated by stray microbes drifting in from the air. Under those conditions, the anthrax struggled. It faltered. Sometimes it died off completely. He didn't treat this as an annoying lab mishap. He treated it as evidence. He realized the microscopic world wasn't a peaceful, static garden. It was a ruthless, churning ecosystem. A jungle. Species battled for food and territory, and some seemed capable of producing chemical weapons to wipe out their rivals. In 1877, he wrote that the life of the infinitely small is a battlefield. He and his colleague Jules Joubert watched this reality play out under the microscope. Airborne bacteria landing in a culture could shut down the growth of anthrax. Pasteur called this antagonistic relationship antibiosis, and even suggested that maybe one day this natural warfare between microbes could be harnessed to help patients. He saw the war. He named it. He glimpsed its potential applications. But he never got his hands on the specific weapon. The idea, however, was out in the open now, a tempting thought drifting through labs and lecture halls. Others stumbled into the same territory. Joseph Lister, the man who had made carbolic acid famous in the operating room, noticed in the 1870s that a sample of urine contaminated by a particular mold refused to support bacterial growth. He labeled the mold Penicillium glaucum. He published this observation, then walked right past it. His mind was fixed on wiping out all germs with fierce antiseptics, not recruiting one germ to assassinate another. The answer was practically glowing on his desk, but his attention was locked on a different solution. Then came one of medicine's cruelest almost discoveries. In 1897, a 23-year-old French medical student named Ernest Chain decided to test a bit of stable boy law he'd picked up at the army hospital where he was training. The grooms told him they intentionally stored saddles in damp, dark rooms so mold would grow on them, because they believed those molds helped the horses' saddle sores heal faster. Duchesne was intrigued. He launched into careful experiments. He identified the mold as Penicillium glaucum, the same one Lister had noticed. He demonstrated that it could protect guinea pigs from otherwise lethal injections of typhoid bacteria. He wrote his work up as his doctoral thesis. Contribution to the study of the vital competition in microorganisms. Antagonism between molds and microbes. At 23 years old, he had, in substance, discovered and documented the therapeutic potential of penicillin-producing molds. He submitted this thesis to the prestigious Pasteur Institute in Paris. It was brushed aside and forgotten. His work was dismissed as naive, a student's cute side project. It never made it into the journals. Soon, Duchesne was drafted. Not long after, in 1912, he died of tuberculosis and infection of the lungs that a future refined form of penicillin would help conquer in other people. He was 37. The world wasn't ready. The whisper was finally spoken clearly, scientifically, but the room was empty. No one was listening. The discovery would have to go dormant and wait for another man in another country with a different mix of luck, timing, and personality. It would have to wait for a cluttered office, an overlong vacation, and a lone wandering spore drifting through an open window in London. The stage for this next act in the saga wasn't some palace of science. It was a cramped, chaotic lab at St. Mary's Hospital in London. The year 1928. The main character, not a crusader or a visionary, but a shy, modest Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming. Fleming was a gifted researcher, especially noted for his work on wound infections during World War I. But he was also, by all accounts, spectacularly messy. His bench was a jumble of glass plates, pipettes, stacked cultures he couldn't bear to discard, and half-forgotten experiments. His workspace drove his tidier colleagues up the wall. That same streak of disorganization, however, would set the stage for something that would redirect human history. In late August, Fleming did exactly what countless Londoners with families did. He went on vacation. He left with his wife and young son for their country place in Suffolk for a couple of weeks. Before he walked out the door, true to form, he stacked several petri dishes on a corner of his bench and left them there. Those dishes contained cultures of Staphylococcus aureus, the bacterium behind everything from pimples and boils to life-threatening abscesses and bloodstream infections. Fleming had been studying variations in staph colonies. He had inoculated the plates, but crucially hadn't bothered to move them into the incubator. He just left them at room temperature, at the mercy of London's fickle late summer weather. It was a small, almost forgettable, lapse routine carelessness. He came back to the lab on Monday morning, September 3rd. The room looked just as he'd left it, crowded, cluttered, humming with both potential and neglect. He started the dull chore of clearing the stack of plates he'd abandoned, glancing at each one before pitching it into a tray of Lysol for sterilization. He wasn't on the hunt for anything big. This was just cleanup. As he was sorting through the plates, a former assistant, Dr. Merlin Price, walked in to say hello and ask what he'd been up to. Fleming, always willing to chat, waved at the growing pile of dishes and complained about the mountain of work ahead of him. Then it happened. The moment. Not a cinematic flash, not a chorus of angels, just a pause, a flicker of curiosity. He picked up one plate from the discard pile, a plate that was literally seconds away from vanishing into disinfectant, and stopped. He stared. Then he turned it toward Price. "That's funny," he said. Some version of that line might as well be the unofficial banner over the gates of scientific discovery. Across the surface of the agar were the expected staph colonies, tiny opaque yellow dots scattered like seeds. But in one area lived an intruder, a coin-sized patch of fuzzy blue-green mold. Contamination, the bane of a bacteriologist's existence. Normally, that's the moment you mutter a curse about sloppy technique and slam the plate into the trash without another thought. Fleming, however, noticed something else. The mold itself wasn't what grabbed him, it was the ring around it. Surrounding that fuzzy colony was a clean, sharp halo where the agar showed clear. A transparent moat in a sea of cloudy yellow bacteria. Inside that ring, staph colonies weren't just missing, they looked like they were in the act of falling apart. Wispy, faded, like the ruins of a city seen from above. The mold wasn't just preventing the bacteria from growing, it was actively chewing through them. In that instant, Fleming recognized that this was not simply a ruined experiment. This was something far stranger. The mold seemed to be secreting a substance, an invisible juice, diffusing out into the agar and massacring staph, one of medicine's most troubling and familiar enemies. His chaotic lab, the odd cool stretch of London weather while he was away, that let the mold get a head start, the returning warmth that finally gave the staph time to bloom, and the simple bad luck of a spore drifting in from somewhere below all lined up to create this delicate scene of microscopic warfare. Later investigation would show that the spore most likely traveled up from the floor below. From the lab of a mycologist named C.J. Latouche, who worked with molds, 1 in a million, maybe 1 in 10 million. Fleming's real brilliance wasn't in conjuring that accident, it was in refusing to throw it away. Most bacteriologists before him had likely seen similar plates and angrily dumped them. They saw contamination. Fleming saw a door. He rescued the plate. He scraped a sample of the mold and started to grow it on purpose in a liquid broth. He identified it as a Penicillium mold. At first, he misclassified it as Penicillium rubrum. Later, it would be identified properly as a rare strain of Penicillium notatum. He then launched a deceptively simple series of experiments. He grew the mold in broth, filtered out the fuzzy growth, and was left with a clear, amber-tinted liquid, his mold juice. Then he exposed all kinds of bacteria to that liquid. The results were stunning. The mold juice was brutally effective against many of humanity's worst bacterial enemies: Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and the bugs behind pneumonia, gonorrhea, meningitis, and diphtheria, the classic gram-positive crowd. But here's where things got truly weird. The juice barely touched certain other bacteria, like the one behind typhoid fever. And most critically, when Fleming mixed that liquid with fresh human white blood cells, they stayed perfectly intact. No damage, no drama. That was the grail. Unlike carbolic acid, the chemical wrecking ball that destroyed everything in its path, this stuff was a sniper shot, a focused toxin, lethal to some microbes and merciful to human cells. A microscopic magic bullet. He named the active substance penicillin. Fleming did try this raw, unrefined broth on a few localized infections. A colleague's infected eye, a stubborn sinus issue. He saw some success. But the miracle was fragile. Penicillin in that crude form broke down fast, its power faded within days. It was ridiculously hard to produce in useful quantities. Fleming was a world-class observer of life, a bacteriologist through and through. He wasn't a chemist. He didn't have the tools or the training to take the next essential step, isolating the pure compound, stabilizing it, and concentrating it. In 1929, he wrote up what he had and published it in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. The paper on the antibacterial action of cultures of a penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of B. influenzae, had all the warmth of a lab fridge. Technical name, cautious tone, understated conclusions. Fleming, at that point, seemed more taken with penicillin's usefulness as a lab trick, a way to selectively kill some bacteria in a mixed sample so you could isolate others than as a wonder drug for patients. He gave a few talks. Interest flickered and died. For almost 10 years, the greatest medical breakthrough of the 20th century sat sleeping in the literature a curiosity, a half-solved puzzle. Patients went on dying from the exact infections that Plate had shown how to defeat. The miracle had been glimpsed, labeled, and then shelved. It would sit there until a new set of people, with a different skill set and a much more urgent motivation, came along. War was coming, and war would not tolerate a miracle left in a footnote. Alexander Fleming now had something uncanny in his hands, a secret whispered not by angels or fate, but by a fleck of wandering fungus. In the dim, gaslit stillness of his lab at St. Mary's Hospital, he began poking at the limits of this strange liquid, the broth where his penicillium mold had grown. He called it, with complete lack of ceremony, mold juice. A name so plain it almost felt like a dare. He would drip this filtered, honey-colored fluid onto plates crowded with bacteria, the microscopic killers he'd devoted his life to watching. Under the lens, savage Staphylococcus, tough Streptococcus, the bacteria behind pneumonia and diphtheria, simply dissolved. They didn't retreat. They didn't slow down. They ceased to exist. This mold juice wasn't just bacteriostatic, something that froze bacterial growth. It was bactericidal, a killer. But it wasn't just any killer. It was picky, in a way that made no chemical sense at the time. The bacteria behind typhoid and certain forms of influenza swam through the juice like it was tap water, untouched, unconcerned. Most astonishing of all, when he poured this broth into a test tube full of fresh human white blood cells, our body's own frontline troops, they came out of the encounter just fine. This was the holy grail everyone had been fumbling toward without quite knowing it. The antiseptics of the day, carbolic acid, mercuric chloride, and the rest, were blunt thugs. They killed germs, but they also maimed tissue and butchered the very immune cells trying to protect you. Too often, the attempted cure was a second attack layered on top of the infection. This mold juice was different. It wasn't a bomb. It was a guided weapon. It seemed to recognize its enemy. Fleming wasn't the kind of man who made big speeches, but he understood perfectly what that meant. This stuff might actually work inside a living human body, not just on a countertop or a scalpel, but in the bloodstream. Fired up, he turned two of his young colleagues, Stuart Craddock and Frederick Ridley, onto a nearly impossible assignment: hunt down the invisible killer molecule inside the juice. Strip out everything else, bottled magic. That meant stepping from bacteriology into chemistry, a world Fleming himself only half spoke. Craddock and Ridley tried to boil off the water from the broth, hoping the active ingredient would remain behind like a concentrated resin of power. But the second even gentle heat licked at it, the antibacterial effect vanished. They tried changing the acidity, shifting the pH to coax it into a more stable form. No luck. Their target was incredibly delicate, a butterfly balanced between acid and alkali. Push a little too far either way and its wings crumbled. Again and again, they toiled, built up hope, and watched it collapse. A promising batch of penicillin-charged liquid would, a few days later, turn into something chemically dull and useless. The magic evaporated almost as soon as they caught it. Still, Fleming moved ahead with the naming. On March 7, 1929, he gave the active substance its formal title, penicillin. A cleaner, more dignified label than mold juice, lifted from the name of the mold itself, Penicillium. By June of that year, he had a paper ready for print. In the British Journal of Experimental Pathology, he laid out the evidence: the mold, the broth, the selective death of certain bacteria, the safety for living cells. He mentioned almost casually that this stuff might be used on infected wounds or as a specialized tool in bacteriology. But when his work hit the scientific world, it landed like a dropped feather. Quiet, barely noticed. Two problems sank it. One was practical. Fleming and his team simply couldn't produce a stable, concentrated form of penicillin. Without that, they couldn't do the flashy demonstrations that grab attention: dramatic animal trials, bold cures, undeniable data. All they had was a weak, watery broth that decayed before they could even run proper experiments on it. To his peers, penicillin wasn't a revolution. It was a technical oddity. Interesting in a narrow way, but not something that looked ready for real-world use. The second problem was timing. The age of chemotherapy had already dawned. Paul Ehrlich's magic bullet for syphilis salvarsan had cracked open the idea of chemical cures. The sulfur drugs were just around the corner, tidy little molecules, stable, manufacturable, and easy to ship. Fleming's mold juice, by contrast, was moody, fragile, and hopelessly impractical. A fairy tale in a bottle. People read his paper, maybe took a note, then turned the page and moved on. For the next decade, penicillin lived like a ghost. Fleming, practical as ever, didn't waste his whole career chasing it. He went back to other lines of work, though he never truly abandoned his strange mold. He kept his penicillin-producing strain, his culture of Penicillium notatum, alive by regularly transferring it to fresh growth medium. The mold became just another familiar resident of his lab, always there on a slant of agar. Every now and then, he'd brew up a bit of penicillin broth, not as a treatment, but as a clever lab reagent. He'd use it to kill off bacteria that were sensitive to it so that more resistant species could grow without competition. He'd share it with colleagues for similar tricks. But that original blazing vision, the idea that this could be an internal cure, a bullet against infection inside the human body, slipped farther into the background. Penicillin stayed trapped inside its fungus, elusive, unstable, refusing to let itself be captured and tamed. Outside, the world staggered toward disaster. Another war was coming. As it did, the thin thread of Fleming's forgotten discovery stretched quietly from London to a different city, a different mind, and a different temperament. That new home was Oxford. Not the postcard Oxford of spires and quads, but a brick practical building, the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology. It was the late 1930s, a decade after Fleming's paper had gone mostly unnoticed. Europe was thick with dread. War felt less like a possibility and more like a scheduled event. In charge of the Dunn School was an unlikely commander, Professor Howard Florey, an Australian with a bulldog build and a personality to match. Florey was the opposite of the charming, dinner-party-type scientist. He was blunt, at times abrasive, but he had a relentless drive and a real talent for two specific things: organizing teams and convincing people with money to give it to him. By training, Florey was a physiologist. He saw the body like a complex mechanical system, organs and cells, locked in endless negotiations and conflicts. He loved fundamental questions more than quick cures. He wasn't out hunting a wonder drug. He wanted to understand the rules of life and death on the smallest scales. Lately, he'd become fascinated by antibiosis, the chemical warfare microbes wage on one another. He wanted to study their weapons. Ironically, this curiosity led him straight back to Alexander Fleming. Not through penicillin at first, but through another Fleming discovery: lysozyme, an enzyme found in tears and saliva that could dissolve certain bacteria. One of Florey's star researchers, a biochemist named Ernst Chain, was assigned to dig into lysozyme and, by extension, dive deep into Fleming's broader portfolio of work. Chain was almost everything Florey wasn't. He was emotionally volatile, fiercely passionate, and blazingly intelligent. A German Jewish refugee who had escaped Nazi Germany in 1933, Chain carried both a razor-sharp scientific mind and the rawness of someone who had seen his world ripped away. As he combed the literature on natural antibacterial substances, he stumbled across Fleming's 1929 paper on penicillin. He read it once, then again. Where others had seen a dead-end curiosity, Chain saw a gauntlet thrown down. Fleming had described what penicillin did, but not what it was. He hadn't explained its chemical structure, its mode of action, or the source of its insane instability. To Chain, that wasn't just a gap in the research. It was a flashing neon sign. Here lies a puzzle worthy of obsession. The same trait that had infuriated Fleming, that maddening instability, looked to Chain like the biggest clue. Only a very unusual, highly reactive kind of molecule would behave that way. If they could isolate it, understand it, and maybe tame it, they wouldn't just have one drug. They might expose an entire new class of chemicals with unprecedented abilities. Chain marched the paper into Florey's office. Florey's first reaction was cool skepticism. Money was scarce. War clouds were stacking up. This was not the moment for a wild goose chase after a 10-year-old curiosity that even its discoverer had set aside. But Chain laid out his case the only way he knew how: logically, chemically, relentlessly. The very instability that made penicillin hard to work with suggested something structurally unique, something powerful, and if that power could be harnessed, it might change everything they thought they knew about fighting infection. Florey, ever the strategist, saw something else too. This strange substance fit perfectly with his interest in microbial warfare. And more importantly, a non-toxic antibacterial agent, if it really worked, would be priceless in the looming conflict. He gave the project a careful, conditional green light. The Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, which had already backed some of Florey's work, agreed to provide a modest grant. The chase was back on. The hunt for Fleming's ghost of a drug had officially resumed. But Florey and Chain couldn't do it by themselves. They needed someone who wasn't primarily a theorist or a leader. They needed a builder. Enter Norman Heatley. Heatley was a reserved biochemist with a Cambridge PhD and a kind of mechanical genius that doesn't come with a fancy title. He wasn't going to dazzle anyone with big philosophical speeches. What he did have was a rare ability to look at a problem and almost instinctively start sketching contraptions in his head. Glass, rubber stoppers, scrap metal, borrowed equipment, it didn't matter. In Heatley's hands, any cluttered storeroom turned into a toolkit. He was the person who could take Chain's chemical demands and Florey's big-picture goals and turn them into actual working apparatus. In 1939, as Britain waded into open war with Germany, this trio, Florey, Chain and Heatley, became the core of what history would call the Oxford team. Florey, the hard-driving general who kept the funding flowing and the project on task. Chain, the volatile, brilliant chemist wrestling with the molecular mystery. Heatley, the quiet engineer-magician who could make their dreams materialize in glass and steel. They didn't set out to become legends. They just wanted to see if they could finally bottle the phantom that had haunted Fleming for a decade. But first, they had to scale up. Fleming had worked on a single petri dish. The Oxford team would need oceans. To get even a tiny amount of purified penicillin for testing, they would have to grow vast swaths of Penicillium mold and then wring the drug out of the broth it produced. The Dunn School was a teaching institution, not a factory. There were no giant fermenters humming away in the basement, no industrial-grade filters. Everything would have to be built from scratch, and that's where Heatley went to work. They needed containers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The mold required shallow surfaces exposed to air, not deep flasks, and the containers had to be sterilizable and stackable. Standard lab glassware was too deep and far too pricey for the scale they needed. Baking trays didn't quite work. Heatley looked around and refused to see things as what they were. He saw only what they could be. His light bulb moment came from an unlikely source. He walked over to the Radcliffe Infirmary, the nearby hospital, and came back grinning with his solution: ceramic bedpans. Shallow, sturdy, easily steam sterilized, and stackable thanks to their shape, they were perfect. Soon the hallways and rooms of the Dunn School were lined with shelves full of lidded porcelain bedpans, each holding a thin layer of nutrient broth. It looked less like a cutting-edge research lab and more like someone had opened a bizarre second-hand hospital supply warehouse. The small group of assistants, many of them women, became known informally as the Penicillin Girls. Day after day, they inoculated, tended, and harvested these makeshift mold farms, moving bedpans like bricks in a never-ending construction project. The smell of mold damp, earthy, slightly sweet soaked into the place. Growing the mold, however, was the easy part. The truly vicious challenge, the one that had defeated Fleming, was pulling the penicillin out of the broth without killing it. Chain's work confirmed what Fleming had learned the hard way. The molecule was insanely touchy. Heat broke it, enzymes degraded it. A bit too much acid or base wrecked it. Standard purification tactics were like trying to handle spider silk with oven mitts. Everything they tried just smashed the penicillin to pieces. They needed something gentle, cold, and fast. Again, Heatley stepped up, fusing chemistry with engineering improvisation. He built what became a legend in its own right, a continuous countercurrent extraction apparatus. It looked like something Rube Goldberg might have drawn during a fever: dream loops of glass tubing, flasks suspended at odd angles, pieces scavenged from dairy cooling systems, and anything else he could scrounge. Here's how it worked. The chilled, slightly acidified mold broth was pumped into the machine and mixed with amyl acetate, a solvent that smelled strongly of artificial pear. Penicillin liked the amyl acetate just a little more than it liked the acidic water, so it moved into the solvent layer. That layer was then pulled off and mixed with a small volume of alkaline water. In the new pH environment, penicillin decided it preferred the water again and jumped back this time in a much smaller volume, meaning it was more concentrated. Wash, separate, repeat. Each cycle left more impurities behind. It was slow, it was stinky, it was far from efficient, but it worked. For the first time, someone was actually capturing Fleming's ghost in a flask. The scale of the process was almost comical in its inefficiency. In 1 week, they might process 500 liters of mold broth, every bedpan, and later every custom ceramic vessel full. And at the end of all that, a smear of crude brown-yellow powder, barely enough to pinch between 2 fingers. It was impure, yes, but it was also stable enough to ship around the lab and hundreds of times stronger than the thin broth Fleming had used. Life at the Dunn School turned into a grind of near-military intensity. Florey prowled the corridors like a demanding commander, always thinking 3 steps ahead: animal trials, dosage, toxicity. He haggled with university committees for space and supplies and tried over and over to make them understand why his team needed hundreds of bedpans and gallons of weird solvents. Chain, in a constant storm of intensity, ran chemical analyses on every new batch of powder, pushing to decode its structure and behavior even as the impurities mocked his precision. Heatley kept refining everything better racks for bedpans, jury-rigged fermenters made from old milk churns, fixes for the 100 small problems that sprang up every day. Outside the lab, bombs were falling. At night, the sky over London glowed an eerie red as German raids turned neighborhoods into fire. The Dunn School windows were painted black. The team worked with the real possibility that one night a bomb might erase not just their data, but the only living strains of their penicillin mold. There was hardly any money. Glassware was washed and reused to the edge of breaking. Equipment was borrowed, repurposed, or built out of scraps. This was science run on ingenuity and exhaustion. By spring 1940, they had finally produced enough of their precious powder to do something meaningful with it. It didn't look like much, just a drab brown flake in a vial. But packed inside was months of labor, stacks of bedpans, rivers of broth, and the desperate hope that it might behave in animals the way it had on plates. The team was ready to leave the safety of glass and steel behind. Mice were waiting, flesh and blood were next. They were about to find out if they were working with a harmless curiosity or the first real miracle of modern medicine. By the end of 1940, the team at the Sir William Dunn School in Oxford had something real in their hands. Not a theory, not just a petri dish party trick. A substance. It didn't look impressive. It was a murky, unstable amber liquid wrung from vats of mold-flecked broth. But in the lab, that fluid behaved like a weapon from another world. On plates seeded with streptococci, it carved out clean circles of death. Against staphylococci, it threw up invisible walls, lethal boundaries where the bacteria simply could not cross. When they moved into live animals, the effect was even more dramatic. Dozens of mice, deliberately injected with lethal doses of bacteria, were pulled back from the edge with tiny amounts of this mold juice. Treated mice were soon scrambling around in their cages, bright-eyed and scrambling for food, while their untreated controls were almost reliably dead by morning. The message was brutally clear. The principle worked. But mice aren't men. A mouse weighs about 20 grams. A grown man can weigh 70 kilograms or more. The math was unforgiving. To treat a single human being, they'd need a dose hundreds of times larger than anything they'd used on mice, and far more than they'd ever managed to produce in the lab. To try penicillin on one person would take nearly everything they had. Months of non-stop work, batch after batch, bedpan after bedpan. If it failed, they would have burned their entire supply on a single doomed experiment. If it succeeded, they'd prove its power, but have almost nothing left for the next case. They needed 2 things: the right patient and the nerve to stake everything on him. They found him just down the road at the Radcliffe Infirmary. His name was Albert Alexander. He was 43, a police constable in Oxfordshire. A solid working man, husband, father. And his life had been completely derailed by one of the stupidest, most ordinary accidents imaginable. Months earlier, in his garden, he'd brushed his face against a rose bush. A thorn scratched the corner of his mouth. The kind of scratch you dab with a handkerchief and forget. But through that tiny cut, bacteria walked in. A mixed infection staph and strep settled in and started to multiply like wildfire. By the time he was admitted to the hospital, the situation was nightmarish. His face and scalp were carved up by abscesses, swollen, tender pockets full of pus. The infection had spread across his head. It reached his eyes. One eye had already been removed. By then, the bacteria had pushed into his bloodstream. Septicemia, sepsis. New infections flared in his bones and lungs. His temperature spiked and stayed there. He drifted in and out of delirium. Nurses worked by rigid wartime routines, doing what they could with what they had. The doctors had thrown everything at it. They'd lanced the abscesses over and over each time they returned. They'd used the newest sulfur drugs, the so-called miracle treatments of the 1930s. The bacteria didn't care. The infection barely flinched. By February 1941, Albert Alexander was, in the quiet language of the ward, hopeless. There was nothing left in the cupboard for him. That made him the perfect candidate. The system had given up on him. There was nothing left to lose. On February 12, 1941, Howard Florey and a young physician, Charles Fletcher, walked to Alexander's bed. They carried in a few small vials the entire usable world supply of penicillin. It wasn't much, just a few 100 milligrams of gritty, impure brown powder dissolved in saline. They started with a 200 milligram dose given intravenously, a tiny amount against the mass of his infection. Then they continued with smaller doses every 3 hours. The vigil began. The first 24 hours were a cruel test of patience. Alexander's fever stayed up. His breathing was still labored. He seemed no better. Florey and his team felt their hopes sagging. Maybe the leap from mouse to man really was too big. Maybe the stuff was poisonous in humans in ways their mice hadn't shown. Maybe they were about to watch him die anyway, having wasted months of work. But the second day told a different story. Alexander slept more calmly. His fever eased slightly. Not a miracle yet, but something had shifted. By the third day, there was no way to pretend it was subtle. His abscesses began to shrink. The angry swelling and redness under his skin softened. Pus drained. The hot, inflamed tissue cooled. His fever broke. He could sit up in bed. He could talk to his wife. This wasn't just improvement. It was a resurrection in slow motion. The staff at the Radcliffe, used to watching infections steamroll through patients, no matter what they did, were stunned. A man they'd mentally walked to the morgue was sitting up, eating, smiling weakly. The Oxford team had their answer. Penicillin worked, not just in mice, not just in dishes, in a human body drowning in infection. Then they hit the wall they'd always known was there. The supply, they simply didn't have enough. Penicillin production back at the Dunn School was running on overdrive. But the process itself was just too feeble. For every gallon of moldy broth, they got a speck of useful drug. They were burning through their stash faster than they could make more. On the fourth day, they were running dangerously low. On the fifth, they were almost dry. Alexander was getting better, but also running straight toward a cliff. That's when Norman Heatley came up with an idea that was as disturbing as it was brilliant. He knew penicillin wasn't broken down completely by the body. A large chunk of it, maybe half, was excreted unchanged through the kidneys and came out in the urine. So they set up a new routine. Every drop of Albert Alexander's urine was collected. Nurses saved it in bottles. It was rushed by bicycle back across Oxford to the Dunn School, where Heatley would stay up through the night working on it like a man panning for gold. He acidified the urine, shook it with ether, pulled the penicillin back out using a miniature version of his extraction setup. Then the reclaimed drug went back into vials and back to the Radcliffe, where it was injected right back into the man who had just passed it. A closed circuit. Drug, body, urine, lab, drug, body again. It kept them afloat for a little while. Another day. Another. But chemistry doesn't care about desperation. Each loop through Alexander's kidneys and Heatley's glassware cost them some penicillin. The losses added up. Their net supply shrank. Eventually, there just wasn't enough left. After 5 days of jaw-dropping recovery, they had to cut the dose, then cut it again. then stop. No matter how heroic the effort, you can't cure sepsis with an empty vial. As soon as the penicillin stopped, the bacteria regrouped. They were wounded but not wiped out. They roared back. The red returned to his skin. Fever climbed. The abscesses swelled again. The infection, briefly driven back, marched forward and reclaimed his body. The team could only stand there and watch as the first man they'd ever successfully pulled out of the grave began to sink again. Albert Alexander lingered another 10 days. On March 15, 1941, he died. By any ordinary measure, the treatment had failed. But in a deeper sense, the experiment was a spectacular success. They hadn't proved that penicillin couldn't save a life. They'd proved that it could, but that they didn't yet know how to make enough of it. The drug's failure was logistical, not biological. A teaspoon of a cure, they learned, is no cure at all. To save one person, they needed a bucket. To save thousands, they'd need a river. Outside the quiet quadrangles of Oxford, the world was providing a brutal reason to build that river. There was a war on. World War II was, in many ways, just World War I, with the volume turned up, same nightmare, different soundtrack. And like the First War, the biggest killer wouldn't be bullets. It would be bacteria riding on those bullets and on the shrapnel and mud. In 1914-1918, for every soldier killed outright, many more died days or weeks later in field hospitals from infected wounds. Doctors had faced gas gangrene, festering staph infections, and septic shock armed with little more than antiseptic washes, scalpels for amputation, and prayers. Deep, dirty wounds, especially in the abdomen or thigh, were almost automatic death sentences. The soil of Western Europe, soaked in manure for centuries, was packed with Clostridium bacteria that loved oxygen-poor pockets inside wounds. They pumped out toxins that liquefied muscle and produced gas that ballooned limbs and made the flesh crackle at a touch. Between the wars, medicine had made some progress. Sulfur drugs, discovered in the 1930s, were a huge step forward. But they were limited. Some infections shrugged them off. They could be harsh on the body, and they weren't a match for many of the bacteria that haunted battlefield injuries. As Britain braced for the inevitable flood of casualties from campaigns in 1940 and 1941, military planners remembered the statistics from World War I in cold detail. They knew disease and infection could be every bit as lethal as the enemy army. So when the story of Albert Alexander reached the British Medical Research Council, it didn't land as a scientific curiosity. It came in like a piece of classified intelligence. Here, possibly, was an answer to their single biggest medical problem of modern warfare. If they could tame penicillin, it would do more than save lives. It would change the math of war itself. Wounded soldiers could be patched up and sent back instead of being written off, or requiring long, resource-draining recoveries. Amputations, once nearly standard for severe limb injuries, could become a last resort. Casualty systems could shrink. Logistics could shift. In the cold terms of strategy, a soldier is an asset. Keeping that asset alive and functional is not just compassion, it's survival. Suddenly, what Florey's team was doing in those brick rooms in Oxford became more than an academic project. It was quietly an arm of the war machine. The war gave them exactly what they'd been missing: overwhelming urgency. The slow, methodical rhythm of lab work collided with the screaming tempo of combat reports and casualty projections. The British government, under immense stress, started funneling resources and attention toward penicillin. The effort became semi-classified, quiet, strategic. But the war that made penicillin a priority also blocked the road in front of it. Britain in 1941 was a besieged island. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but German bombers still came at night. Cities burned in fragments. The country's industry was running flat out, making planes, tanks, weapons and ships. There was no spare capacity, no empty factories or idle machinists to build the precise, delicate facilities needed for large-scale penicillin manufacture. This wasn't like cranking out artillery shells. It required sterile fermenters, specialized equipment, and a kind of biochemical engineering no one had yet perfected. Even if they managed to build such a facility, it would stand out as a prime bombing target. One good hit could erase the entire operation equipment, staff, and the invaluable mold strains all at once. Florey could see the trap. Britain had the scientific lead, but not the industrial safety net. The only way to take penicillin from miracle to mass reality was to relocate its next phase of development somewhere far from the reach of German bombers, somewhere with massive industrial muscle. In mid-1941, there was exactly one place on Earth that fit that description: the United States. The decision that followed was made in the tone of wartime confession. Florey and Heatley would have to go. They'd leave embattled Britain, cross U-boat-infested waters, and carry the secret of penicillin to America. They would really beg for help. It was an act of profound humility. They were handing over one of Britain's most valuable scientific victories to another nation. But the alternative, sitting on a miracle they couldn't scale, was worse. Better to share the secret with an ally and see it used than guard it in a lab notebook while men died for lack of it. Even getting there was dangerous. The North Atlantic was crawling with German submarines, and civilian travel was rare and risky. They eventually secured seats on a Portuguese flying boat, a neutral carrier that would take a long dogleg route from Lisbon to New York. Then came the question that might sound small, but was absolutely critical. How do you transport the mold itself? They couldn't load fermenters of broth onto the plane. Too fragile, too obvious, and far too likely to die en route. They needed something compact, discreet, and resilient. Heatley, in his usual low-tech genius, had the answer. He knew the mold produced hardy spores, tiny dust-like survival capsules that could ride out harsh conditions and spring back to life when given food and moisture. So in the days before departure, he and Florey staged a strange ritual in their Oxford lab. They took the coats they'd be wearing on the trip. With a small brush, they painted concentrated cultures of Penicillium chrysogenum, a newer strain they'd found with better productivity than Fleming's original, into the fabric of the pockets and seams. They rubbed it in until the cloth took on a faint greenish-brown stain. Then they let it dry. To any customs officer, it looked like dirt, old tobacco, or a long-forgotten spill. To a microbiologist with a culture flask, it was a vault full of genetic code. They also carried a small vial of spores as a backup. But the mold-infused coats were the real insurance. If bags were lost or glass broke, they would still be walking onto American soil wearing the future of antibiotics in their linings. In late June 1941, the two men left their blackout-shrouded island, carrying a miracle in their clothing. Their mission: convince a country still officially at peace to commit staggering industrial power to a drug for a war it hadn't entered yet. They arrived in New York in a heavy, humid July. For two men used to Britain's ration lines and dim cityscapes, America was blinding storefronts bursting with goods, streets lit up at night, restaurants serving thick steaks and strong coffee. It felt like stepping from twilight into daylight. But it was also a country wary of foreign entanglements. The trauma of World War I still hung over it. As far as most Americans were concerned, Europe's wars were Europe's problems. Florey and Heatley weren't carrying official diplomatic passports. They were academics with letters of introduction, a handful of modest data, and a story about a mold that might change medicine. They went first to the giants of American pharma Merck, Squibb, Pfizer. Executives listened. They were intrigued. But intrigue isn't a contract. The companies saw headaches everywhere: microscopic yields, unstable product, finicky extraction processes. To retool factories for such a temperamental substance when there was no obvious domestic market yet, in a country not yet at war, it looked like lousy business. Nothing solid came out of those first meetings. Some interest, no commitments. Still, science is as much about who you know as what you know. Using connections in the American research world, Florey eventually found his way to Washington, D.C., to the National Research Council. From there, he was steered someplace unexpected, not to a glamorous East Coast lab, but to an agricultural research station in Peoria, Illinois, the Northern Regional Research Laboratory, or NRRL. At first glance, NRRL didn't look like the birthplace of a medical revolution. Its scientists weren't chasing cures. They were learning how to turn corn into chemicals, alcohol, citric acid, and other industrial inputs. Their expertise wasn't medicine, it was fermentation. But as soon as Florey and Heatley laid out the penicillin problem, the Peoria team got it. They didn't see a drug development challenge. They saw a fermentation and yield challenge, exactly their home turf. Heatley stayed behind in Peoria to work alongside one of NRRL's key figures, Andrew Moyer. He brought everything Oxford had learned through trial and misery: the culture methods, the quirks of the mold, the fragile chemistry. Together, the Americans and the lone British biochemist got to work. They knew the Oxford bedpan method of growing the mold on the surface of shallow liquid would never cut it on factory scales. The future was deep tank fermentation, growing the mold submerged in huge, continuously aerated vats. But the Penicillium strain from Oxford hated that lifestyle. It sulked and underperformed in deep liquid. The first big step came when Moyer started tinkering with the recipe, the food for the mold. After rounds of experimentation, he found that adding corn steep liquor, a thick brown byproduct of corn processing, and lactose to the growth medium boosted penicillin output by about tenfold. A tenfold jump doesn't just tweak economics, it rewrites them. Suddenly, penicillin began sliding down the mental scale from alchemy toward industry. The price curve pointed the right direction, but Peoria's greatest gift to the story was still on the horizon, waiting quietly in a pile of rotting fruit. The core magic of penicillin had already been proven. Fleming had seen it on that forgotten plate in London. Florey and Chain had seen it rip through infections in mice and briefly turn a dying policeman into a man with a fighting chance. The problem was no longer whether penicillin worked. The problem was how little of it there was. Fleming's original mold Penicillium notatum was a lazy aristocrat of a fungus. It would only grow as a thin film floating on top of liquid. And even when you pampered it with the best nutrient broth you could brew, it produced drops of penicillin that barely qualified as a trickle. To treat just one seriously infected human, you needed hundreds of liters of broth. Those 500 liters the Oxford team spent a week coaxing along, enough for a few doses. The whole process felt medieval. Glass flasks, bedpans, pie dishes, anything shallow and clean enough to hold a few millimeters of broth. The scale was absurdly mismatched to the stakes. World wars don't get solved by bedpan. If the Allies wanted penicillin to matter, they needed an entirely different kind of mold. Not a finicky surface dweller, but a blue-collar workhorse. A fungus that would happily multiply in churning, aerated vats and flood the broth with penicillin. So the United States did something very American about the problem. It ordered a massive, distributed, barely controlled search. The War Production Board, now overseeing penicillin at the strategic level, gave the Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria a strange mission: find a better mold. NRRL scientists were agricultural chemists. They lived and breathed fermentation. They knew from experience that nature wasn't stingy, it was simply varied. For every mediocre mold strain, there might be another cousin out there that was wildly generous. So they fired up a kind of global scavenger hunt. Army pilots flying supply and combat routes were given sampling kits. Every time they landed somewhere, new dusty runways in North Africa, muddy strips in Asia, islands in the Pacific, they were told to scoop up soil and send it back to Peoria. Civilians got pulled into it too. Anyone who found something moldy was encouraged to mail it in. Bread gone furry, cheese gone sour, shoes, leather, fruit. If it sported fungus, it might be useful. The lab in Peoria started to fill with decay. Moldy bread, moldy cheese, moldy book covers, tins of dirt from 4 continents. Each sample was tagged, logged, and tested. Technicians worked station by station in a rhythm that must have felt like ritual. Take a new sample, Streak its mold across the surface of a petri dish that's already been covered with a smooth lawn of Staphylococcus. Incubate it. Wait. Look for a clear zone around the mold where bacteria have been killed. Most of the time, nothing special happened. Some molds made soft, fuzzy growth and left the surrounding staff untouched. Others produced small, unimpressive clear rings, no better than the original Oxford strain. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Thousands of molds were catalogued and dismissed. There were a few near-hits-better strains from soil in India, South Africa, but not the quantum leap they needed. It was a strange kind of pressure. The war wasn't pausing. Casualties weren't waiting politely for fermentation yields to catch up. And still, the best they could say was, almost, but not yet. The breakthrough didn't arrive from some exotic front line. It came from a grocery store. In the summer of 1943, one of NRRL's lab assistants, Mary Hunt, had been assigned a simple but crucial job. Walk the local market stalls, buy whatever looked moldy, and bring it back. She did this so reliably that colleagues started calling her Moldy Mary. One day she walked in with a cantaloupe. It wasn't just a little past its prime, it was collapsing, sagging into itself, its rind swept over with a striking golden-green velvet of mold. It went into the intake queue like any other sample. It was tagged NRRL 1951. Then the plates came back. The zone of inhibition, the ring around the mold where staph had been annihilated, was huge, much larger and cleaner than almost anything they'd seen. This wasn't normal mold. When they grew it up and measured, the numbers made the earlier strains look pathetic. This mold produced far more penicillin per unit of broth than Fleming's Penicillium notatum. And just as importantly, it actually liked being submerged in liquid. It didn't need to cling to the surface like a nervous swimmer. It was comfortable in deep fermentation. This one miserable cantaloupe from a Peoria produce stand contained, by blind chance, the exact strain the world needed. Penicillium chrysogenum NRRL 1951. Almost every gram of penicillin made in the world for the next half-century would trace its lineage back to that fruit. That specific mold became the ancestor strain used in industrial production. But the Peoria scientists weren't content with better. They wanted obscene. They began hitting their new crown mold with radiation X-rays, ultraviolet light on purpose. They weren't being cruel for cruelty's sake. They were trying to accelerate what evolution does naturally. Throw random mutations at a problem and see if any of them are more useful. Most mutations broke things. Some strains became worse producers. Others slowed down or died. But every now and then, a mutation would hit just the right spot in the mold's DNA and boost its penicillin output. Out of this forced evolution came one monster strain labeled X1612. It pumped out penicillin at a rate about 1,000 times greater than Fleming's original mold. 1,000 times. At that point, the magic had its engine. The limiting factor was no longer the mold's generosity. It was our willingness to build the industrial machinery to support it. The dream of the robed alchemist in a stone tower was dead. In its place stood the blueprint for a future biotech industry, and the entire chain traced back, improbably, to a collapsing melon bought by a woman nicknamed Moldy Mary. A hyper-productive mold, however, is just a seed. You still need soil. Penicillium chrysogenum, that new king of molds, needed an empire to grow in. Not beakers and bedpans, but steel and steam and pipes and valves. Penicillin production had shifted from a microbiology question to an engineering one. The core challenge was oxygen. Penicillium is aerobic. It has to breathe. It needs oxygen constantly, and not just enough to stay alive, but enough to power the metabolic process that spits out penicillin as a byproduct. In Oxford's shallow bedpans, air came naturally. The mold sat on top of the liquid, exposed to the room. That was exactly why those methods couldn't scale. Only a razor-thin layer of broth did any real work. Everything below was just dead weight. To unlock true industrial output, they needed to move into deep tank fermentation-filling giant vessels with broth and mold and blasting the whole mix with air. But that changed the problem. How do you get enough oxygen to every bit of thick, living broth inside a steel tank the size of a house? If you just pumped air at the bottom, like in a fish tank, the top might get plenty while the bottom suffocated. The US War Production Board looked at this and knew they couldn't leave it to improvisation. They pulled in the big players Merck, Squibb, Abbott, and a Brooklyn firm that had been quietly perfecting its own fermentation wizardry. Charles, Pfizer, and Cubbon. Pfizer wasn't known for drugs yet. Its crown jewel was citric acid, made by fermenting sugar with molds. But that meant it already had something everyone else lacked: an institutional memory of large-scale mold cultivation. The strange smells, the temper of a tank, the subtleties of aeration, they'd lived with that for years. When the US government came knocking, Pfizer's president, John Smith, saw the risk and the opportunity. Going all in on penicillin could bankrupt the company if it failed. It would mean ripping up their production lines and betting everything on a finicky, still experimental war drug. He did it anyway. Pfizer essentially stopped doing almost anything else and focused its engineers and scientists on cracking deep tank fermentation for penicillin. The facilities that rose from those decisions looked less like hospitals and more like industrial shrines. Picture a building the size of an airplane hangar, lined not with offices but with massive cylindrical tanks, each 2 or 3 stories tall and holding up to 10,000 gallons of liquid. These were fermenters. On the outside, they looked like giant boiler drums, webbed with gauges, pipes, and valves. Inside, they were alien ecosystems. Each tank first had to be sterilized, blasted with high-pressure steam, until there wasn't a living microbe left in its metal skin. Any stray invader could ruin an entire batch, especially the kind of bacteria that produce penicillin-destroying enzymes. One wrong germ and the mold would dutifully produce penicillin, only for that hitchhiker to eat it as fast as it was made. Once clean, the tank was seeded. A pure Penicillium chrysogenum culture, grown in small flasks under strict sterile conditions, was expanded in stages into larger volumes until finally a significant amount of live culture was ready to move into the tank. Then came the mold's food. Here, the Peoria lab's earlier work paid off again. The best nutrient brew turned out to be a mixture based on 2 nearly worthless agricultural byproducts: corn steep liquor and lactose. Corn steep liquor, thick, brown and foul-smelling, was a waste stream from corn wet milling. Lactose was milk sugar, another cheap bulk material. Together they made a perfect feast for the mold. And Illinois had endless corn. Once the tank was full of broth and seeded mold, the real ballet began. Long steel shafts with massive impellers like ship propellers began churning through the liquid, keeping it in constant motion, so mold and nutrients stayed evenly mixed. At the same time, huge compressors pushed filtered, sterile air under pressure through Sparger's devices at the bottom of the tank that broke the air into millions of fine bubbles. Those bubbles rose up through the liquid, feeding oxygen to the fungus. The whole tank operated as a sealed, pressurized, sterile world. Technicians in white coats watched it through thick glass ports and an army of gauges and thermometers. They didn't just see numbers, they could read the mood of the tank. Slight changes in pressure or pH, a faint rise in temperature, a different smell at the exhaust vent, all could mean the difference between a good batch and a catastrophic loss. For about 7 days, the mold lived its strange industrial life. It ate the corn liquor and lactose, consumed oxygen, grew into a dense, suspended mass, and slowly flooded the broth with penicillin. The smell was strong and unique, earthy, fungal, a kind of damp, life-on-overdrive odor that hung in the air of these factories. Once the fermentation run was complete, the hard work started again. Hidden inside tens of thousands of gallons of broth were just ounces of penicillin. The molecule was still the same old troublemaker, delicate to heat, sensitive to pH. Chemists had to extract it fast and gently without destroying it. They used a series of solvent extractions similar in principle to what Heatley had done in Oxford, but now scaled up to the ton. The broth was acidified. Penicillin was drawn into organic solvents like amyl acetate or butyl acetate. Then the solvent was mixed with alkaline water to pull the drug back out. Each step was carefully temperature controlled. After purification, the penicillin was converted into a stable salt and dried into a yellow powder. That powder could then be shipped, stored, and reconstituted in hospitals across the world. At first, even these massive operations barely produced enough. A full 10,000-gallon run might yield enough purified drug to treat just a handful of badly infected patients. But nobody stopped. Everyone iterated. Moyer and his colleagues tuned the nutrient mix. Pfizer's engineers refined airflow and mixing. Chemists sharpened extraction methods. Each tweak gave a few more grams, a bit more purity. Grams turned into ounces, ounces into pounds. By 1945, American plants were pumping out over 650 billion units of penicillin every month. A lab curiosity had become a manufactured torrent. All from a stray spore in London, a stubborn Australian in Oxford, a moldy cantaloupe in Illinois, and a series of steel tanks in Brooklyn and beyond. That torrent was now ready to be aimed. Not at bombs or bullets, but at the infections that rode in behind them. The miracle was about to wash up on the beaches of war. The miracle didn't arrive on the battlefield like some glowing relic. It showed up in cardboard and ice. It came in small refrigerated crates, in glass vials of yellowish powder paired with ampules of sterile water. To the medics trudging through mud and the surgeons knee-deep in blood and bandages, it was just another line item on a supply manifest labeled inventoried, placed on a shelf alongside morphine, sulfur powder, plasma. Before 1944, penicillin was so scarce that it might as well have been mythic. It was reserved for top officers, critical VIPs, and the rare case deemed strategic. It was treated like a national asset, parceled out with the stinginess of a state secret. But the roaring factories in the American Midwest had changed the math. By spring 1944, as Allied forces massed in England for the largest amphibious assault in history, the flow of penicillin had finally swelled from a trickle into something closer to a river. For the first time, they had enough to cover not just the generals, but the rank and file. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, when landing craft dropped their ramps on the beaches of Normandy and men surged into machine gun fire, medics wading ashore with them had penicillin tucked into their bags. In the hours and days that followed, as wounded soldiers poured into aid posts and field hospitals strung out behind the lines, penicillin's real power began to reveal itself. War isn't just about bullets and explosions. It's about what those bullets and explosions carry with them. Shrapnel from an artillery shell doesn't glide cleanly through tissue, it rips muscle, splinters bone, and shoves deep into the body whatever filth it finds on the way in. Soil, manure, uniform fibers, metal fragments. A compound fracture where bone bursts through skin is like putting out a welcome sign for every microbe in the environment. In every war before this one, the main killer wasn't the initial trauma. It was infection that came afterward. A soldier might survive the blast, survive the bleeding, only to rot from the inside as bacteria took root. Hospitals reeked with the sweet, sick smell of gas gangrene. A Clostridium infection that devoured muscle, formed pockets of gas under the skin, and left limbs swollen and crackling to the touch. The only viable answer was desperate surgery amputation well above the wound line, hacking off arms and legs in an attempt to outrun the advancing plague. Now the script was changing. On the battlefield, medics still used sulfur powder as an immediate measure, sprinkling it directly into fresh wounds. It wasn't particularly gentle, and it wasn't always effective, but it was better than nothing. The real transformation happened once a soldier made it to a field hospital. Surgeons would first do what they'd always done: debride, cut away dead, obviously contaminated tissue, open abscess pockets, trim ragged edges, all the mechanical work of giving a wound the best possible odds. Then came the needle. A nurse would reconstitute the yellow penicillin powder with sterile water, draw it into a syringe, and inject it deep into a muscle. Not once, but every 3 to 4 hours, around the clock. Early penicillin was cleared from the body quickly, If you wanted it to work, you had to keep the levels up constantly. The injections hurt. The impurities in those early batches made the shot burn like fire. Men learned to dread the sight of the nurse on penicillin duty. Some joked about it, many cursed. But almost all of them accepted the pain because they saw what happened next. Wounds that previously would have festered and gone black instead stayed healthy pink. Instead of a creeping line of red climbing up a limb toward the heart, there was nothing, no ominous streaks, no spreading heat. Fevers that once climbed and held steady until delirium took over now broke. Temperatures dropped, sweat dried, sleep came. Doctors who had spent their entire careers watching infections eat men alive suddenly had a new experience. They started winning. They could take surgical risks that would have been suicidal in earlier wars. They could open the chest to remove shell fragments near the heart. They could painstakingly reconstruct shattered femurs with plates and screws without assuming infection would destroy their work. The numbers are blunt and almost hard to believe. In World War I, the mortality rate from bacterial pneumonia in military hospitals hovered around 18%. In World War II, with penicillin, it fell to under 1%. Death from compound fractures, broken bones that pierced the skin and almost always went septic had run as high as 25%. With penicillin, that figure collapsed to a fraction of its old value. Amputations, once the automatic endpoint of many battlefield limb wounds, became something surgeons could often avoid. Soldiers weren't just living, they were keeping their arms, their legs, their futures. Morale shifted in ways that were hard to put into words. For the first time in the history of organized warfare, a soldier really knew that if he could just make it to the medics alive, the odds weren't stacked hopelessly against him. Infection, the ancient shadow trailing behind every violent injury, had been cut down to a fraction of its old power. The logistics behind all this bordered on insane. Penicillin was fragile. It needed refrigeration from factory to front line. It traveled in cooled compartments on ships and planes, then in refrigerated trucks into the war zones. The Allies created a new breed of officer to manage it, penicillin control officers, whose entire job was to oversee distribution, track stocks, and make sure doses went where protocol said they should. The drug was precious, and it was not to be squandered. They even formed specialized penicillin units, small mobile teams that could be dropped into newly liberated areas to set up makeshift labs and treatment centers, using this new weapon not just on soldiers, but on civilians who'd been living under untreated infections for years. There was a moral dimension to that, but also a brutal strategic one. A dead soldier is gone. A wounded soldier is a logistical black hole consuming transport space, medical staff time, hospital beds, medicine, food. An army with too many wounded and not enough dead is at risk of grinding to a halt under its own medical burden. Penicillin changed that calculus. By shortening recovery times and preventing long, complicated, infection-riddled hospital stays, it allowed armies to keep their fighting strength up. Men returned to duty instead of languishing for months or dying. Allied troops began to understand that their side had something the Axis didn't. When German and Japanese soldiers were captured and treated in Allied hospitals, many of them were astonished by the level of care, especially the use of this strange new drug for wounds they would have considered fatal. The miracle wasn't a single event. It was a nearly invisible wave of small salvations. A surgeon closing a chest wound and sleeping a little easier. A medic seeing a wound stay clean instead of turning foul. A pneumonia ward eerily quiet because the beds were empty. Each one was a subtle proof. The microscopic world was no longer untouchable. The mold from Fleming's messy lab, refined by the Oxford team, supercharged by a rotten cantaloupe, and multiplied in deep steel tanks in America, had finished its long pilgrimage. On the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, penicillin did something no weapon had ever done before. It changed the very nature of war by making survival the norm after wounds that used to be sure death sentences. The yellow powder was more than a medicine now. It was an industrially produced form of hope. When the war ended in 1945 and the guns went quiet, That hope started flowing in a new direction. Home. The military had given penicillin a single, obvious enemy: the infected soldier. In peacetime, it was about to meet a far more complex battleground: civilian life. The world it came home to was still haunted by infections that most of us today can barely imagine fearing. In that pre-penicillin civilian world, the sick room was a place of ritual dread, curtains drawn, voices lowered. The doctor's bag held tools for comfort, not cure. Bed rest, whiskey, cold cloths, maybe a mustard plaster or a splash of carbolic acid in the room. A scratch from a rose bush that turned red and hot could grow a red line up the arm, a literal streak of death. Parents watched those lines with a mix of superstition and grim calculation. Pneumonia killed quickly and efficiently, often in the prime of life, drowning people in their own lungs. Scarlet fever could tear through a school, leaving behind damaged hearts and small, fresh graves. Syphilis, the whispered disease, crept through communities under a cloak of shame. Left alone, it could spend years quietly undermining the brain, the nerves, the bones, ending in madness, paralysis, and a slow, grotesque unraveling. Childbirth was a spinning chamber of Russian roulette. Women bled, tore, got infected. Puerperal or childbed fever, spread often by the doctors themselves, could snatch away a mother days after a seemingly healthy delivery. Surgery was a pact with fate. You only went under the knife when there was no other option. And even then, you understood that surviving the surgery itself didn't mean you'd survive the infection that might follow it. Into that world, penicillin began to seep. The vast factories that had fed the war machine shifted gears. Those same fermenters at Pfizer in Brooklyn, at Merck in New Jersey, at Squibb in New Brunswick that had run full-time for the Normandy campaign were retuned for civilian supply. At first, penicillin was still tightly controlled, rationed. Committees decided who got it and who didn't. Some lives were quietly judged more valuable than others. But the American industrial learning curve is steep. Within a remarkably short period, penicillin went from rationed miracle to widely available treatment. By the late 1940s, it was becoming almost routine in some places. A vial in a doctor's bag, an injection at the clinic, a prescription filled without drama. The transformation was so fast it almost seemed like a glitch in history. Decades of fear evaporated in a handful of years. A child with a strep throat or scarlet fever illnesses that once meant weeks of terror and the real risk of long-term damage or death could now get a shot and be back on their feet in days. Pneumonia wards emptied. The quiet groans, the rattling coughs, the slow wet deaths that doctors had watched helplessly for generations suddenly became rare. Doctors who had spent their careers more as witnesses than as fixers suddenly held in their hands something dangerously close to magic. Patients walked into their offices dying and walked back out again healed, or at least on the path. Maternity wards changed almost beyond recognition. Childbed fever, once the scourge of obstetrics, shrank to a rarity. Mothers and newborns walked out of hospitals together instead of being separated by a funeral. Venereal disease clinics saw their workloads transform. Syphilis, which had been treated with brutal regimens of arsenic, and mercury cures that almost poisoned the patient as badly as the disease, now met a cleaner ending. A series of penicillin injections could stop the spiral before it reached its most horrific stages. It was a quiet but profound loosening of one of history's oldest stigmatic chains. Surgery stepped into a new era. Before penicillin, a surgeon's skill ended at the edge of the scalpel. Beyond that lay chance. Post-operative infection haunted every decision. Abdominal surgery for anything but the most desperate conditions was rare and terrifying. Opening the chest cavity to touch the lungs or the heart was practically taboo. Orthopedic surgery was limited by the awareness that a single stray bacterium could turn a reconstructed joint into a disaster. Penicillin changed not just outcomes, but attitudes. It became a net under the high wire. With a reliable tool against bacteria, surgeons pushed forward. They began to operate deeper and more often. Complex bowel surgeries, chest surgeries, repair of blood vessels. Each new frontier leaned on the background confidence that if infection showed up, and it would, they now had a serious chance of knocking it flat. Over the following decades, this confidence became the platform under all of modern high-stakes medicine. Heart valve replacements, organ transplants, artificial hips and knees, open heart surgery, neurosurgery in tissue that absolutely could not tolerate infection. All of it assumes something very specific, that when bugs get in, and they will, we have the means to control them. Without antibiotics, our glistening operating rooms would be elaborate infection factories. Public perception of medicine shifted with the same speed. Doctors stopped being just grim-faced professionals delivering bad news and start dates for funerals. They became problem solvers, technicians of the body, wielders of compounds that could, apparently, turn back death itself. This is the cultural moment the Forbidden Dispensary wants you to really sit with. The birth of the belief that for every disease there ought to be a pill. That belief was not born out of philosophy, it came out of penicillin, out of our first true encounter with a medicine so powerful that it made ancient fears vanish in record time. While the world was partying on this newly won ground, another, quieter story was beginning to unfold. Who gets the credit? A miracle this big demands a face, one name to hang the legend on. In 1945, the Nobel Committee in Stockholm tried to answer that question. On October 25th, they announced that the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine would go to 3 men for the discovery of penicillin and its curative effect in various infectious diseases. Sir Alexander Fleming, Sir Howard Walter Florey, and Ernst Chain. Scientifically, it was the right call. Historically, it set off a slow, bitter fire. For the public, especially in Britain, there would only ever be one hero. Alexander Fleming. He had the perfect origin story. The quiet Scot, the messy lab, the forgotten plate, the open window, the wandering spore. You couldn't ask for a better script. It was neat, romantic, and easy to film in a newsreel. One man, one lucky break, one world-changing insight. Fleming, who was painfully shy in private, turned out to be strangely gifted at managing this public persona. He didn't go around claiming to have single-handedly saved civilization. Instead, he cultivated a kind of humble mystique. When people called him the inventor of penicillin, he'd say things like, "Nature makes penicillin, I only discovered it." It was a line that played perfectly. It sounded modest and deep at the same time. It let the myth swell while keeping his hands technically clean. The British press, especially under media baron Lord Beaverbrook, grabbed that narrative and ran with it. In wartime, Fleming was the embodiment of British cleverness, a homegrown scientist whose accident and insight were now saving our boys. Meanwhile, Florey and Chain watched this unfold from the sidelines with very little enthusiasm. They were the men who had actually taken penicillin from observation to operation. Howard Florey was the mastermind, the builder of the Oxford team, the one who had seen potential in a dusty paper from 1929 and had the spine to organize, fund, and drive a brutally difficult research campaign through the chaos of war. Without him, penicillin would still have been a paragraph in an old journal, but Florey hated publicity. He thought it was vulgar, a distraction from real work. When reporters showed up at the Dunn School, he either refused to give them more than dry technical briefings or avoided them altogether. He believed the science should speak for itself and that the effort was collective, not the achievement of a lone genius. That left a vacuum. Narratives hate vacuums. Fleming's story rushed in to fill it. Ernst Chain, for his part, had an even sharper reaction. He was the chemist who had done the core, horrifyingly complex job of extracting and stabilizing penicillin. Without his work, Fleming's mold juice remained exactly that juice. It was Chain's insight and obsessive labor that turned it into something you could weigh, store, inject, and trust. Chain was a refugee from Nazi Germany, a man who had lost his country, seen his people persecuted and murdered, and who understood exactly how much factual truth mattered. To him, seeing Fleming crowned as the sole hero was infuriating. In Chain's private assessment, Fleming was a footnote, the guy who saw something and then didn't do anything truly decisive with it. To Chain, the real feat was in the chemistry and the development, and that was his domain, not Fleming's. He also resented Florey's refusal to fight the PR war. Where Florey saw media as beneath him, Chain saw the distortion of the historical record as a serious injustice. By the time all three stood together in Stockholm in December 1945, their relationship was strained at best. They were colleagues and co-winners, but not friends. Each represented a different piece of the puzzle: observation, organization, and chemistry. The Nobel Committee had tried to recognize that complexity, but the public had no interest in nuance. It wanted a single name for the miracle. It picked Fleming. For decades, kids were taught that Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and that was that. The messy middles Florey's leadership, Chain's chemistry, Heatley's engineering, Peoria's cantaloupe got trimmed off. Howard Florey, in some circles, became known as the forgotten man, a scientist whose leadership had helped save more lives than almost anyone else in human history, yet whose name barely registered outside of specialist circles. There's a weird irony here. Penicillin was the ultimate team. Effort international, interdisciplinary, a story of shared grind and shared genius. But the world chose to remember it as the work of a solitary figure in a cluttered room, staring at a dirty plate. The mold didn't care about the credit. The bacteria definitely didn't. But the humans, as usual, did. What mattered more in the long run was what penicillin kicked off next. It wasn't just a drug, it was proof of concept. It showed that we could find weapons in the soil itself, against our microscopic enemies. Penicillin's runaway success lit a fire under pharmaceutical companies and academic labs. If one mold on one plate held the key to so many infections, what else was out there? Microbiologists and chemists fanned out into the dirt. Literally, they started scooping up soil samples from forests, fields, gardens, riverbanks, anywhere microbes waged their endless wars. The ground beneath our feet, it turned out, was loaded with antibiotics. In 1943, at Rutgers University, a soil microbiologist named Selman Waxman discovered streptomycin, produced by a bacterium called Streptomyces griseus. It was the first antibiotic that worked against tuberculosis, the white plague that had haunted humanity for centuries, filling sanatorium porches with coughing, fading patients. Waxman later won his own Nobel Prize. More importantly, his work opened the floodgates. From soil microbes came chloramphenicol, the tetracyclines, erythromycin, and a whole arsenal of others. The 1950s and 60s turned into a golden age of antibiotic discovery. For a while, it looked like we might have actually pulled off the impossible, turning infectious disease into a solved problem. Each new bacterial threat seemed to be met with a new antibiotic answer. We built all of modern medicine on top of that illusion. Cancer chemotherapy, which shreds the immune system, only makes sense if you assume you can protect patients from opportunistic infections. Without antibiotics, many chemo regimens would be acts of cruelty. Neonatal intensive care keeping fragile, premature infants alive in incubators depends on the ability to treat bacterial infections they can't yet fight. Transplants, major surgeries, implanted devices like artificial joints and heart valves, all of these create massive windows of vulnerability to bacteria. Antibiotics are the glass we pretend separates us from that storm. For 3 generations, we've lived in a world where infection was no longer the final chapter, but a solvable problem. We got used to it, too used to it. And the whole time, the bacteria were watching, adapting, learning. Even at his Nobel podium in 1945, Alexander Fleming saw this coming. In his lecture, he described a simple scenario. A man with a sore throat takes penicillin, but not enough. He feels better, stops early. The weakest bacteria die. The strongest, the ones with slight resistance, survive. They multiply. He then coughs on his wife. She gets pneumonia from the newly hardened bacteria. The penicillin that helped him no longer works on her. She dies. I hope this evil can be averted, Fleming said. "We didn't avert it. Every time we use an antibiotic, we're pressing an evolutionary gas pedal. We kill the microbes that can't handle the drug, the few that can through random mutations in their DNA live on. With no competition, they flourish. Their resistance genes get copied billions of times and passed sideways to other bacteria like trading cards. We supercharge that process through human behavior. Doctors writing prescriptions for colds and flus, viral infections that antibiotics do nothing against, just to quiet patients. Patients not finishing full courses, leaving behind the toughest survivors. Whole herds of livestock being fed antibiotics daily, not to treat disease, but to make them grow a little faster and survive filthy, overcrowded conditions. We didn't just use penicillin and its cousins, we drenched the planet in them. The result is the world. The Forbidden Dispensary is talking to you from now, the age of superbugs. MRSA methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus haunts hospitals, turning old familiar skin infections into potential death sentences. Multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis stalks prisons and clinics, demanding months of treatment with harsh second-line drugs. We're staring down strains of gonorrhea, urinary tract infections, and pneumonia that shrug off almost everything we throw at them. The golden age of new antibiotics has slowed to a crawl. The easy finds have already been dug out of the soil. Developing new ones is scientifically hard and commercially unsexy. There's more profit in a daily pill for blood pressure than in a last resort antibiotic you only use sparingly. So here we are. The story of penicillin isn't a happily ever after. It's a warning delivered in hindsight. Fleming, Florey, Chain, Heatley, Moldy Mary, the Peoria crews, the Brooklyn fermenters, they handed us a second chance, a reprieve, a breathing space in the ancient war between humans and bacteria. For about 70 years, we lived like the war was won. We built an entire medical civilization on that assumption. Now we're getting reminders louder and louder that it was never a surrender. It was a ceasefire, one we've been steadily breaking. The mold on that plate in 1928 didn't end the war. It gave us one spectacular campaign, one run of victories. The enemy has adapted. The question now is whether we can adapt faster and whether we've learned enough from this first miracle to avoid wasting the next one if we're lucky enough to find it. That's where the Forbidden Dispensary leaves you for now, standing halfway between a miracle and a warning, staring at a future that looks more and more like the past we thought we'd buried.